In the autumn of 1956, Britain sent warships to Egypt. The target was the Suez Canal, a waterway that carried the lifeblood of the British Empire's remaining supply chains, a choke point that London had controlled for 80 years. The military operation was textbook. Egyptian air defenses were overwhelmed in hours. The canal zone fell in days. Britain won every battle it entered. Then Eisenhower made a phone call. Washington informed London that unless British forces withdrew immediately, the United States would begin selling its holdings of British pounds sterling on the open market. Britain, still recovering from the debts of World War II, could not survive a run on the pound. The empire that had never lost a naval engagement in the Mediterranean withdrew from Suez within weeks, not because it lost the war, but because America held the financial architecture hostage and pulled the trigger. The pound never recovered as a reserve currency. The British Empire was functionally over before the soldiers made it home. That was how reserve currency dominance actually ends, not through military defeat, not through revolution or invasion, through a single demonstration at a single choke point. That the currency everyone assumed was indispensable could be made deliberately, surgically optional. 68 years after Suez, something is happening in the Strait of Hormuz that carries the same structural weight. The details are different. The direction of the arrow is reversed. But anyone who remembers what happened to sterling should be reading the fine print very carefully. On a Friday, on the 14th day of what American military briefers were calling Operation Epic Fury, a senior Iranian official said the following to CNN. Iran is considering allowing oil tankers to pass through the Strait of Hormuz if payment is made in Chinese yuan. That sentence is the most consequential thing said in this conflict, not because of what it threatens, because of what it reveals has already been quietly built. To understand why that one sentence carries the weight it does, you need to stand inside the daily mechanics of the global oil economy. Not as an abstraction, but as the unglamorous operational reality it actually is. When a factory in South Korea needs to keep its lights on, its government buys oil. That oil might come from Kuwait, from Iraq, from the UAE. But before the money moves, South Korea's central bank converts Korean won into US dollars. The transaction does not happen in won. It does not happen in the local currency of the seller. It happens in dollars. It has happened in dollars for every oil transaction between those two parties for 50 years. This is not because South Korea particularly loves the dollar. It is because the infrastructure of global energy trade, the settlement systems, the contracts, the tanker insurance underwriting, the pricing benchmarks, was built around the dollar. Specifically, it was built around the dollar because in 1974, Saudi Arabia made a deal with the Nixon administration. Price all oil in dollars, receive American military protection in return. The other Gulf producers followed. The Petrodollar system was born. What that system created was structural, permanent demand for US dollars from every country on Earth that needed energy, which was every country on Earth. Full stop. Countries do not accumulate dollars because they want dollars. They accumulate them because their energy supply requires it. That forced demand is what allows America to run trade deficits without its currency collapsing. It is why American sanctions are devastating, because cutting a nation off from dollar access cuts it off from the ability to buy energy. It is why America can borrow more cheaply than any government in history. The petrodollar is not a policy among other policies. It is the foundation beneath the foundation. It is the reason the rest of American power is possible. And what Iran just put on the table is a condition under which the Strait of Hormuz, the channel that carries roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply, operates outside that system. The announcement on Friday was framed by most coverage as a proposal, a negotiating position, a what-if floated to CNN. That framing misses what is actually happening. Since the first day of this conflict, Iran has shipped at least 11.7 million barrels of crude oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Every barrel went to China. Every transaction was denominated in yuan. China's tankers moved freely through a waterway that was simultaneously closed to vessels from every other major economy. American tankers were being struck at an average of one per day. European tankers were sitting anchored outside the strait, burning through insurance costs, watching their cargo become more expensive by the hour. The tankers carrying yuan-denominated cargo passed without incident. This bifurcation, yuan flows freely, dollar flows don't, has been the operational reality of the strait for 2 weeks. It is not a proposal. It is not a hypothetical. It is what has been happening while the press conferences described a military campaign proceeding according to plan. The official announcement was not Iran introducing a new condition. It was Iran describing an existing reality and asking whether the world wants to ratify it permanently. This distinction matters enormously. A proposal can be rejected. A precedent that has already been operating for 14 days is a different kind of object. It already has data behind it. It already has tanker captains who have observed it. It already has energy ministers in Seoul, Tokyo, New Delhi, and Brussels running the arithmetic. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened in the last 14 days. China has been constructing the infrastructure for this moment for years. The Cross-Border Interbank Payment System, CIPS, is China's alternative to SWIFT, the dollar-based messaging system that underpins most international financial transactions. In 2025 alone, CIPS processed the equivalent of $245 trillion in yuan-denominated transactions. That was a 43% increase from the previous year. The system now connects over 1,300 financial institutions across more than 100 countries. It is not theoretical. It is not in beta. It is operational at a scale that can handle a significant fraction of global trade. 4 years before this war began, China bought Iranian oil at discounted prices, establishing a bilateral yuan-foreign precedent while Iran was under Western sanctions. Those transactions were not loud. They did not generate press releases. They were designed to establish the habit, the legal framework, the settlement infrastructure, and the trust required to operate a yuan-based oil trade relationship, quietly below the threshold of what American policymakers were inclined to treat as a strategic threat. What Iran's announcement at the Strait of Hormuz has done is take that bilateral precedent and offer it to the world. The question being posed, implicitly, to every energy importing nation is this. You have watched yuan tankers move freely through the strait for 2 weeks while your tankers sit idle. You know the infrastructure exists to transact in yuan. You know the Chinese banking system can handle the settlement. The question is whether you want to keep paying the premium, the financial, political, and logistical premium of staying in the dollar system, or whether you want to take the option that is now visibly available. Countries do not stay in more expensive, more restricted systems out of loyalty. They stay because the alternative is worse. For 50 years, the alternative was worse. The alternative meant forfeiting dollar reserves, losing access to SWIFT, facing the kind of economic consequences that followed nations who tested the dollar's supremacy. The alternative was the wilderness. What has changed, structurally, in 14 days, is that the alternative now has a functioning gateway. It has tankers that move. It has payment rails that settle. It has a precedent that has been observed by every shipping executive and energy minister in the world. The coverage of this conflict has been understandably focused on the main actors, America, Iran, China. But the more consequential decisions are being made in quieter capitals by governments that have much more to gain from optionality than they have to lose. Consider India, the world's third largest oil importer, a country that has historically resisted both American pressure to cut Russian oil imports and Chinese pressure to pivot toward yuan infrastructure. India has its own ambitions for the rupee and international trade. India has its own complex relationship with Iran, geographic proximity, historical ties, a population that imports a significant fraction of its energy from the Gulf. New Delhi has been watching the Strait of Hormuz bifurcation with the careful attention of a country that cannot afford to be locked out of either system. India has not announced a position. India does not need to announce a position yet, but the arithmetic Indian energy planners are running right now is not favorable to the pet. Consider the Southeast Asian economies. Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines that collectively import enormous quantities of Gulf crude and have enormous trade relationships with China. These are not ideologically anti-American countries. They are pragmatic countries that will follow the path of least economic resistance. If yuan-denominated oil transit becomes normalized, the question for their central banks is not geopolitical. It is operational. How much of our reserve portfolio should shift from dollars to yuan to ensure we can access the energy system that is actually open? Consider the African oil importers, many of whom already have deepening financial relationships with Chinese institutions, who already see a yuan-based alternative as preferable to a dollar system that has historically come attached to conditions. IMF, austerity policy, compliance governance requirements. For these countries, The yuan alternative is not just cheaper, it is freer. None of these countries need to make dramatic announcements. None of them need to publicly break with the dollar. The shift happens in the quiet, daily accumulation of reserve management decisions. Central bank by central bank, percentage point by percentage point, the structural demand for dollars as an operational necessity decreases. The dollar does not collapse. It deflates, slowly, measurably, and in the end, irreversibly. The American press coverage of this conflict has been dominated by military metrics. Missile batteries degraded, drone capacity reduced by stated percentages, targets struck. The metrics are real. They are also measuring the wrong thing. The financial consequences of what is happening in the Strait are not abstract future risks. They are already manifesting in the present tense. The dollar has been under sustained pressure since the conflict began. Dollar-denominated oil futures are pricing in a world where a significant fraction of Gulf supply requires yuan to access. The Treasury market has seen unusual selling pressure from Asian central banks that are watching their dollar reserve requirements shift. These are not dramatic crashes. They are the early indicators of a structural reorientation, the kind of slow bleed that does not generate headlines, but does generate consequences over the span of years. More immediately, the war itself is costing money. Sustained military operations in the Middle East, at the scale and intensity of the current campaign, are expensive in ways that compound. The United States can fund them because of the exact financial architecture that the Strait of Hormuz situation is eroding. The dollar's reserve status allows America to borrow at lower rates than its fiscal position would otherwise warrant. As that status weakens, as the structural demand for dollars decreases, as the interest that America must pay on its debt rises even incrementally, the cost of the military campaign increases at precisely the moment when the campaign's strategic returns are declining. The Trump administration this week reversed the ban on Russian oil imports. This is not a minor tactical adjustment. Russia was, until recently, the principal adversary that American sanctions policy was designed to isolate. The reversal was necessary because the Hormuz closure created a supply crunch that American allies in Europe and Asia could not sustain. The country that America went to war partly to demonstrate dominance over the Iran axis is now being invited back into Western energy supply chains, because the war's consequences left no alternative. Leverage has not simply failed to work in this conflict. It has reversed. The sanctions designed to pressure Iran are being selectively suspended. The military campaign designed to reopen the strait has produced a strait that is open for yuan and closed for dollars. There is a geopolitical actor in this story who has said almost nothing publicly and whose silence is more significant than most of the statements that have been made. Saudi Arabia is the country whose 1974 deal with the United States created the petrodollar system. Saudi Arabia is the country whose continued commitment to dollar-denominated oil pricing is the single most important pillar holding the system upright. Saudi Arabia has been watching the Strait of Hormuz situation carefully from a position of acute vulnerability. Its own airbases have been struck in this conflict, and from a position of deepening financial complexity with China, which is now its largest oil customer. Riyadh has not issued a statement endorsing the yuan for Hormuz proposal. It has also not issued a statement condemning it. It has not reaffirmed its commitment to dollar pricing. It has said, in the language of diplomatic silence, nothing. That silence is a data point. A Saudi Arabia that was confident in American protection and committed to the petrodollar system would be loudly reaffirming its position right now. The silence suggests a kingdom that is calculating, as it has been calculating since the Abraham Accords and the China-brokered Saudi-Iran normalization deal of 2023, what the geometry of the next era looks like, and whether being on the dollar side of a bifurcating world is still the obvious choice. If Saudi Arabia even partially shifts toward accepting yuan for oil, even for a subset of transactions, even quietly, the petrodollar system does not gradually decline. It fractures at its foundation. The American administration has stated publicly that Iran is on the verge of surrender. This may be accurate in the narrow military sense. Iran's missile capacity has been degraded. Its air defenses are compromised. Its primary oil export hub at Karg Island sustained serious damage, forcing a pivot to the Jask terminal on the Gulf of Oman. By conventional military metrics, Eden is Lucene, but the yuan condition does not require Iran to win militarily. It requires only that the precedent survived long enough to become structurally embedded in the decisions of enough central banks, enough shipping companies, enough energy ministries around the world that it cannot be reversed by a peace agreement. That threshold is measured not in missile batteries or air defense systems, but in oil transactions. Every tanker that transits Hormuz in yuan is a data point. Every central bank that adjusts its reserve composition in response to 2 weeks of observed bifurcation is a structural shift. Every shipping company that signs a contract priced in yuan for Hormuz-adjacent routes is a commercial reality that postdates whatever ceasefire eventually emerges. The American urgency is not, despite the press conference framing, about preventing Iranian nuclear capability in the next 30 days. It is about preventing the yuan precedent from surviving long enough to become permanent. Every day the strait stays bifurcated as a day the precedent deepens. The financial clock and the military clock are running at different speeds, in different directions. In 1956, the British government genuinely believed it was acting from a position of strength. It had the military capacity to take the canal. It had the political justification. It had Alice. What it did not have was the financial architecture to survive American pressure on the pound. The parallel to the current American situation is not comfortable, but it is precise. America has the military capacity to strike Iranian targets. It has been striking them. It has the political justification, at least domestically. It has allies, though they are increasingly uncomfortable ones. What is being targeted is a financial architecture that is being undermined, not by missiles, but by a currency condition at a choke point. Britain's error in 1956 was not military. It was the assumption that having the power to do something meant having the power to sustain the consequences of having done it. Eisenhower exploited the gap between those two things by threatening the pound. Iran, guided by a Chinese-designed playbook that has been in development for a decade, is exploiting the same gap with the dollar. The American military can strike targets in Iran indefinitely. What it cannot do, without costs that compound in ways the campaign planners did not model, is force the reopening of the strait on dollar terms, when yuan terms are available, functional, and already in use. The British pound never recovered from Suez. Not because it lost a military engagement, because the world observed, at a specific moment of crisis, that the pound could be made dispensable. That observation, once made, could not be unmade. There is a specific moment in the erosion of a reserve currency when the process becomes self-reinforcing. It is the moment when enough alternatives exist that hedging away from the dominant currency becomes rational risk management rather than political statement. We are not there yet with the dollar. The dollar remains the dominant reserve currency by a significant margin. SWIFT still processes the majority of global transactions. The yuan's share of global reserves, while growing, remains modest. But thresholds in financial systems are not linear. They are step functions. The British pound's decline from reserve currency to ordinary currency did not take decades after Suez. It took years. There was a period of apparent stability, and then there was a period of rapid adjustment, and then it was done. The adjustment phase looks, from inside it, like a sequence of manageable individual decisions. From outside it, in retrospect, it looks like a collapse. What Iran has done at the Strait of Hormuz is create the conditions for a step function, not necessarily trigger it. The dollar system is far more deeply entrenched than the pound was in 1956. But the yuan for Hormuz precedent, if it survives this conflict, will have demonstrated something to every central banker and energy minister on earth. There is a functional alternative. It has been tested under pressure. It worked. And the cost of using it is lower than maintaining exclusive dollar exposure. That demonstration cannot be undone by a military victory. It can only be undone by a peace settlement that closes the precedent before it calcifies. And the clock on that is running. Iran's yuan announcement is not a threat. It is a bill. The bill is addressed to the system that has governed global energy trade since 1974. It is itemized clearly, pass in yuan, or wait. The bill is being delivered at the choke point that handles a fifth of the world's daily oil, by a country that has already spent 2 weeks proving it can enforce the condition. The geopolitical history of the last 50 years was built on a specific, durable fact, that the dollar was not optional for anyone who needed energy. It was the toll. It was the infrastructure. It was the condition of participation in the global economy. Nations that tried to price oil and other currencies Saddam Hussein's Iraq moved toward euros. Before the 2003 invasion, Muammar Gaddafi discussed a gold-backed African currency. Met consequences that demonstrated the cost of the experiment. What is different now is that the infrastructure for the alternative actually exists. CIPS is operational. Chinese tankers are moving. The transactions are settling. The oil is arriving. The experiment is not theoretical. It has a 2-week track record and 11.7 million barrels of evidence. America's response, militarily significant, strategically dissonant, has not changed that evidence. The bombs fell. The targets were struck. The yuan tankers kept moving, somewhere in Beijing, in an institution that does not hold press conferences and does not issue statements for Western financial media. The outcome of a decade-long project is being quietly noted. China did not design this war, but it designed the conditions, the CIPS infrastructure, the yuan for oil bilateral precedents with Iran and Russia, the patient accumulation of alternative financial plumbing that made this outcome possible. When the war began, when the strait closed, when Chinese tankers moved and dollar tankers didn't, the architecture was already in place. The conversion from bilateral experiment to global precedent required, in the end, one sentence from one Iranian official to one journalist. That is how reserve currency transitions actually happen, not with declarations of war or signed surrenders, with the accumulation of individual decisions, made by pragmatic actors optimizing for their own interests, each one small enough to be dismissed, together irreversible. The Petrodollar was born in 1974, with a deal between Nixon's Treasury Department and the Saudi royal family, in a room that also did not hold press conferences. It transformed the world economy without most of the world understanding what had happened until years later. What is being born now, or what is being mortally threatened, depending on the next 30 days, is the successor architecture. It does not have a name yet. It does not have a formal agreement. It has a condition, a choke point, and a currency. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency until it wasn't. The transition took years, but the decision took a moment. A specific moment at a specific choke point when the architecture of power revealed itself to be dependent on a financial foundation that a stronger power was willing to threaten. That moment happened in 1956 at Suez, and it ended the British Empire's financial era. It may be happening again. The choke point is different. The currency is different. The direction is reversed, but the structure of the moment, one country believing it can sustain an action that a more powerful financial actor has decided to make structurally unsustainable. That structure is identical. Pay in yuan or wait. The world is doing the math. Some of it has already reached its answer. This is the Cycles of Power. Thanks for watching. See you next one.